Welcome everyone to Regulatory Affairs Aspects of Diversity in Clinical Trials webinar hosted by AfriSummit in collaboration with South African Clinical Research Association, SACRA. I'm Marjorie Wilson, the manager and producer of the third AfriSummit. AfriSummit will take place in Cairo, 8th to 11th of October, connecting national regulatory authorities and industry, covering 2 days of pharma, 2 days of medical device, discussing regulations of African countries to support the access and growth of these markets. Today, we explore the population diversity in clinical trials data, delve into regulatory approvals and drug acceptance, draw insights from other diverse markets, and look at steps we can take to address drug ethnic disparity. We have the privilege of hearing from Naledi Biki Mtombeni, SACRA chairperson and founder of the South African-based clinical research service consultancy, AfriLead Tech. With over 17 years of diverse experience in the clinical trials field, Ms. Biki is driven by a passion for growth and excellence within the clinical research industry. Her journey leads to various leadership roles, including project operations director, local clinical trial manager, and regional studies manager across Africa, Asia, and Europe. With a profound understanding of ethical guidelines, including GCP and the Declaration of Helsinki, Ms. Biki collaborates with ethics committees and IRBs to ensure ethical conduct in clinical research. Currently, she leads the SACRA input to the ICH GCP R3. A warmest welcome to her and each and every one of you, and we thank South African Clinical Research Association, SACRA, for the invaluable support in making this event possible. I'd like now to bring up Biki. Welcome, Biki, to the webinar.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll start sharing my screen. You'll let me know. You can see my screen clearly. Okay.
Yes, all good?
Okay. All right. I would like to thank everyone that has made time to join this meeting today. I understand that is in the middle of the day and everybody's quite busy, but being here to learn together is much more important. So first of all, I just want to state a disclaimer that the views that I'll be expressing, they are my views. They are not that of SACRA. And I would also like to express that I will be illustrating case studies. The data that I will be presenting, it's factual, but the assessment of the data, it's more illustrative so that you can understand the topic at hand. So I'll be talking to you about diversity in clinical trials data. We'll look at African regulatory approvals and give insight into drug acceptance. Okay, trying to go to my next slide. Okay, so Marjorie already introduced me. I'm the current SACRA chairperson. SACRA is an organization that represents people that work in the industry in South Africa. And we currently work as an EXCO that is volunteering to run the organization. The purpose of the organization is to actually be a conduit that ensure increased number of conduct of clinical trials in South Africa. And I'm also a founder of a South African-based consultancy company called AfriLead Tech. Okay, where do I start? And why is this discussion today important? I'll just take you through a little bit of a highlight of what happened to me around June. I actually I've always had an issue with hypertension. So I normally regulate my hypertension with exercising and running and all those kind of things, and sometimes healthy diet. And it happened in June that my blood pressure was way out of range, and my doctor decided to prescribe Prexam 5. And when I looked at the package insert, I saw that it is written that if you are of a black origin, since you may have higher risk of angioedema, and this medicine may be less effective in lowering your blood pressure than in non-black patients, you know. So I became concerned about those kind of content in the package insert. However, why is diversity in clinical trial important, and why racial diversity more especially? I'm not going to focus on different elements of diversity, which we know there is many, but I'm gonna focus today on racial diversity. Did we know that Africans' population is projected to nearly double to 2.5 billion by 2050, contributing to over 60% of global population growth? This is very important. If you can see the changes here on this graph and the growth of the population, you can see that the African population will continue to grow, and you're able to see it nicely on this slide. And this information, I get it from Africa CDC. And I'm still basically introducing my topic. If you look at FDA, they actually present the clinical trial drug snapshot. They call it drug trial snapshot. So the summary report of 2022 was produced, I think, in Jan 2023, and it gives number of drugs products that were registered by the FDA. What is interesting with their report is that they are able to show the number of participants by different demographics that contributed to that data that led to the registration of the drug. So I'm not going to dwell much into that, but you can access this information data. And I think many of the people or many of the speakers lately that have been talking about diversity are making reference to this. But I actually just got information for this novel therapies that were approved to treat heart, blood, kidney, and endocrine diseases. And you can clearly see that for the different drugs here, I didn't study the drugs. What I studied was just to look at the demographics so that I can give a background for you today. So you can see that 91% of the participants in all those clinical trials were primarily white, and you can see the contribution, the data that was contributed by the Black population, and then you can see the Asian and the Hispanic. And that, if you recall well, I was focusing on the heart, blood, kidney, and endocrine diseases. There were multiple registration for different categories of diseases, but I focused on two. The next one is infectious diseases. When you look at the infectious diseases, you can see here that the contribution, at least for this drug, it was 44% white and 44% black. And this drug, if I recall well from the report, it was primarily for HIV-related indication. And then the other drugs were for other fungal diseases, and I think there was one for a very rare fungal diseases. And then you can see that the infectious diseases percentage contribution of data from the other minority groups globally, it's lesser than the white population. This was just to give you a background to see the amount of data that is being contributed by different demographic groups focusing on race in clinical trial data that leads to registration. So now I want to take you through this illustrative case study. And I want to inform you that this is data that I got from the net and is not that of the company, but this is publicly available data that you can find in the net. This is a case study so that we can have a meaningful discussion. So please do follow through so that we can have the right discussion at the end. So this is a case study of a report that I got for Keytruda, which is a product of Merck, and this is registration data which was submitted in Australia. The trial details that I focused on from the report is the study called Keynote 590 that was designed to randomize 700 participants globally. Approximately 160 patients were from China, were planned to come from China from the global cohort. But then there were additional participants that were randomized from China in an extension study for this study. Overall, there were 168 centers worldwide, and we can see here Africa was represented by South Africa. And many of us, we have seen from different presentation or if also from global databases that South Africa and Egypt in Africa, they do have the highest number of clinical trials that are taking place in those two countries. And then the patient population for this trial, the Keynote trial, it's people with advanced unresectable or metastatic adenocarcinoma or squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus. So just bear in mind of this information as we continue with the discussion. When we looked at the demographics of the participants that were part of the intent to treat group, we were able to see that the contribution from the different races from that keynote trial is highlighted as below. So you can see that the Asian demographics, they had 53% of the data, and we can see 37% of the data from the white population, and then we can see from the Black, African American, and the people of multiple races, the percentage was quite low. Moving ahead, I would like to bring your attention to the South African National Cancer Registry. Remember, I'm trying to illustrate to you the relationship between clinical trials data and registration of a product. So I've just showed you the data from a keynote study, and I highlighted the different percentage of data that was contributed by different races. When you look at this now from the South African Cancer Registry, it shows data for people that were diagnosed with esophagus cancer of the esophagus in South Africa. And based on that, you are able to see the percentage on race. Black males, there were 46%, it took 46% of the overall diagnosis of esophagus cancer, and Black females, 35%. I don't have to explain this bars. You can clearly see that. When I present this, I need you to remember what I shared when I presented the data for the keynote study. What then does this mean? So using the National Cancer Registry information, you can say in 2020, there were a total of 2,677 new cases of esophageal cancer, which was diagnosed in South Africa. And you saw the sex distribution where 1.15 were cases were females and 910 were males and 910 were females. And you were able to see the racial distribution there, where we had a total of 46% that were male, which was 942, and then the females that were Black were 720. And you can see here with the white had the lowest number of cases with 226, and among them 63 cases were females and 3%, that is 3%, and 163 were among males. And then furthermore, I did highlight on the Asian ethnic group percentage, and you can see there were only just 22 cases. And in South Africa, the multi-race, we still refer to colored people. And in that manner, you can see there were 3% females and 4% males. So this data, basically, it also provides the rank in diagnosis. The data also provide the rank of esophageal cancer diagnosis in 2020 for each racial and gender group. For example, of all the cancers that were diagnosed in 2020, the Black males had the 10th highest number of cases amongst all groups. And percentage distribution, you were able to see the 46% as I've shared earlier. This is the raw data, and you can be able to find it in the NICD, National Cancer Registry. So what does this case show us? When we look at the data from the clinical trial keynote and we look at the South African cancer data, we can see the differences in racial demographics between the data set. We saw from the clinical trial data that the Asian population was represented at 53% of enrolled participants, and the whites at 37%, and the other groups were less than 3%. So in contrast, if you look at the South African cancer data, there's a higher number of cases among Blacks individuals and a lower number of other racial demographics like your white and Asian people. And the Black people accounted for the higher percentage of newly diagnosed esophageal cancer. So the clinical trial data demonstrate a significant lack of racial diversity as an illustrative case, with a strong overrepresentation of an Asian and white participants. Remember, this is just one case that I compared, and it doesn't mean that is all the studies. But however, I would like us to have a discussion looking at this data. And this is an example of lack of diversity, which may impact generalizability of trial findings to a broader population. The underrepresentation of American Indian or Black Black people it raises a concerns whether the trial adequately addresses the need and potential responses to treat this population. And we can see, obviously, there was a higher rate of esophageal cancer in African population, as I discussed earlier. In the discussion, we need to look at diversity and how the data is representative of all the different population groups. So let's draw some insight from other diverse markets. I hope you were able to capture my introduction, making you understand using that case that we, as if we were to use the South African data and say, we generalize the diagnosis of esophageal cancer in Africa, we can basically say that Black people have a higher chance of being diagnosed with esophageal cancer versus the other races based on that data. So should a product that was tested in the percentage that I demonstrated as an example from the keynote study be eligible for registration in Africa? You know, so this is the gist of the talk. And how do we improve that? What are some of the actions that can be taken to improve that? I'm not going to give a reference to the genetic discussion for different ethnicity, because I think this has been discussed in many platforms, and I think there is a lot of awareness now when it comes to genetic disparity or genetic differences in different ethnic groups. But I would like to I want to draw insight from other diverse markets, and we can see how those lessons can be applied for drug acceptance in Africa. So let's consider, based on that study, but I think we can discuss it later. Based on the case study, should the data be acceptable in Africa? We can talk about that later. What I want to draw you attention to is what are the requirements for clinical trial data in Asian markets? I've put some references of which I've used in this discussion. So when drug sponsors, when pharmaceutical markets or drug sponsors consider registration their products in China, Japan, and India, they are required to meet certain regulatory requirements on the clinical trial data that is collected. They need to look at the pharmacokinetics and the ethnicity. And ethnicity can significantly impact drug pharmacokinetics, which is how the drug moves through the body. The studies have shown that drugs can be metabolized differently in individuals of Asian descent than in other populations. This is a key reason why countries are cautious about accepting foreign clinical data that does not influence a sufficient representation of their own population's ethnicity. As an example, in Japan requires foreign clinical data to meet specific standards. It needs to be conducted at a reliable medical institution. It needs to follow good clinical practice, which I think is the same for many countries, and it needs to provide raw data for review. Japan also adopted the ICH E5, which outlines requirements for assessing foreign clinical trial data adequacy and the need for bringing studies with local population if data is insufficient. In China, historically, they required that all clinical data be collected within the country. But in 2019, they relaxed the guidelines a little bit, and then they said that the data must be reliable and comply with Chinese and international standard. And then the Chinese government, they assess data for ethnic sensitivity, and they classify it as acceptable, partial acceptable, or reject it based on the presence of ethnic sensitivities. And then they then require a bridging study should the data not be acceptable. And in India as well, they also used to have strict requirements for additional data with Indian population. But then they relaxed their requirement in 2019, where they allowed drugs approved in certain countries to receive marketing authorization without local clinical trials, but provided there is a likelihood of ethnic sensitivity or differences in safety and efficacy. Should there be those differences, they do request for a phase 4 study to be conducted in India. So what is important here is that companies that are looking to enter this market without having costly and time-consuming bridging studies, they need to carefully plan and evaluate whether their new drugs have ethnic sensitivity. So through understanding of the pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamics and metabolism and other factors that affect drug-to-drug interactions. So that was, for me, a lesson, and we can discuss it further later. Is it something that we can apply in Africa? If we apply in Africa, what does it mean for the African continent when it comes to drug registration? So there are various organizations and networks across countries that should aim on conducting multi-country and multi-regional clinical trials. If there's a solid evidence available to evaluate the existence of ethnic differences between the same region areas, it will lead to increase in efficacy of drug development. Should we be conducting additional studies? However, we know that there is new requirements now when it comes to diversity, which is being spearheaded by the FDA. But how does that apply, and how has it been applied in registration of drugs in Africa? Looking back to the example of Keytruda that I shared earlier, if that package is received by a regulator in Africa with a data that has less representation of the majority of the population, as an example in Africa, is the data acceptable? So what are some of the steps for addressing this disparity? What strategic action can we take to bridge the ethnic disparity gap in drugs that are registered in Africa? Okay, so I'm going to switch a little bit from what I was presenting, but I want to say, where are we with some of the solutions that can be employed to improve these changes? Looking from the when I started presenting my topic. So we know that there is a cost to increase manufacturing or to have more manufacturing of drugs happening in Africa. We know that there's a limited local and regional pharmaceutical manufacturers. In Africa, there's a relatively small number of local and regional pharmaceutical manufacturing companies, totaling around 375. These companies cater to a population of over 1 billion people, with the majority of them situated in North Africa. In contrast, Sub-Saharan Africa has a concentration of these companies in only 9 out of 46 countries on the continent. This figure becomes notably distinct when compared to countries like India, as I discussed earlier, in China, which actually have more drug manufacturers. So obviously, if we are not producing the drugs locally, it's still going to be a challenge, because in my view, when I look at what the FDA is spearheading, and even in their documents, as much as they are talking about minorities, they're talking about minorities within the US, in an example, in my understanding. But when you look at the people that they regard as minorities, those are the majorities in the African landscape. So how do we contribute to a significant, meaningful change when it comes to that? And obviously, if we increase manufacturing and if we have more companies that are manufacturing drugs in Africa, that could be another way of leading the cause. Another example or another thought is the operational capacity. We know that there's more changes. There's the African Medicine Agency that has been initiated, and many African countries signing up into it. And for us in the clinical trials industry, we're only looking forward to this, because this will help improve the discussion when it comes to this kind of issues that impacts the continent. Because currently, it may be that diversity is being discussed, but by whom and where? And should it be discussed by 54 different regulators in different time aspects when we are actually representing the same population? So how can we use the upcoming AMA to create opportunities to inform diversity of clinical trial data? These are just questions that I have in mind. I don't have the answers. The other point that I would like to make is, can African countries recruit? Can we recruit participants in Africa? I think we can. One of the key issues that is being highlighted when they talk about recruitment is patient engagement and trust. Can we build trust? Do we need to build trust with our communities in Africa for them to be able to engage in clinical trials? From my experience in South Africa, I've seen in many trials that I've worked in, people or participants are more receptive to clinical trials. And we have seen with previously reported articles where they highlight that many people that participate in clinical trials, they want to go back to the clinical trials. And reason being that they get to learn a lot more in clinical trials. They get to gain more in clinical trials, more than the drug. They gain the relationship with the investigator. They gain the understanding of how to manage their diseases. So I think patient engagement is already open in Africa, and the trust, there may be some elements that we may need to work on, but generally, I think Africa is able to recruit participants into clinical trial. And then standard of care, thinking of standard of care, there's in one of the documents that I'm highlighting here, they basically do state that in Africa, it takes longer for drugs to get into the market. First of all, is the drug getting into the market. So if a drug is approved by FDA today, it may take another 3 to 5 years for it to be approved in South Africa as an example, and maybe in other African countries, it can take even longer. That basically may also challenge the standard of care. And it's not only just drug approval, it's also accessibility of that drug, because many of the participants may not have access to the latest standard of care because of the cost of drugs. That can be an issue, but are there any opportunities for us in Africa to resolve those kind of issues? But we are able to recruit still with those challenges, because we still have disparity when it comes to the needs of the patients in Africa. Do we have research infrastructure? I think we have research infrastructure. Research infrastructure, I mean, we have bigger sites in Africa that can recruit clinical trial participants? Leaning back from the infectious diseases studies, many NGOs and even private pharmaceutical companies and local governments have invested a lot in Africa as a whole to build big research centers that are able to run clinical trials. We do have the operational capacity in research infrastructure where our ethics bodies have been capacitated to be able to evaluate clinical trials. We have seen recently with the COVID disease assessments and how the COVID trials actually were run in different African countries. So I do think we do have the research infrastructure, we do have the expertise, and we do have the operational bodies to actually run those trials. The capacity of the research sites, we are able to run big clinical trials. I mean, maybe in future discussion, we can actually start showcasing the number of bigger clinical trials sites that we have, and even the areas where we have opportunities to bring in new sites. This one for me, I think it's the biggest one, collaboration and partnership. I call it collaboration and partnership. How do we collaborate with the pharmaceutical companies, the research organization, and the African Health Institution to increase diversity in clinical trials? How many sponsors, big pharma as an example, are doing trials in Africa? And what kind of trials are they doing in Africa? Are they open to doing non-communicable and communicable diseases in Africa? Which kind of therapeutic area are they open to do in Africa? We know that lots of infectious diseases studies have highlighted earlier are conducted in Africa, and which makes sense because there's a high prevalence of those diseases. But we can see that the trajectory is changing. There is more percentage of people that are impacted even by different cancers, as I illustrated earlier. How can we actually trust that the African research side or African researchers are able to run those trials and they are able to contribute meaningful data to inform registration of products that will in the end up in Africa? As I highlighted earlier, there may be delays in registration, but at the end of the day, those drugs will end up being available in Africa. So we need to ensure that all those drugs that are being trialed and those that will end up being registered in Africa, they have meaningful data that represent our people in Africa. The other big issue is the visibility of our capabilities as Africa. Let's continue to show off what we are able to do. I mean, there's quite a lot of conferences that are happening, and I think we need to continue doing that to showcase the capabilities of the African continent in order to run those big trials, so that we can build trust with this big pharma or even small biotech companies that are willing to come into Africa. And when we say coming into Africa, we need to increase the number of African countries that are participating in clinical trials. So, in my conclusion, before we move into the next session where we can discuss further this, what I've just presented, at the end of the day, we are all patients, you know? So for me, I think if we can think of the fact that I work in this industry, if I am to have a condition, I want to be able to receive a drug that has been trialed in the people that are of my genetic makeup, you know. So I think we are all patients, and I say in advancing diversity in healthcare research for a healthier future, we are all fundamental patients. At the end of the day, our shared humanity transcends boundaries, and our health is universal concern. Diversity matters profoundly to me as a Black person working in the industry that holds the power to transform healthcare. I do yearn to be more than just a contributor to research that shapes the future of healthcare. I want to benefit from this outcome. I envision my community where I come from, you know, I come from deep rural areas in South Africa, and communities that are like mine, reaping the benefits of research breakthrough. And to achieve this, we must prioritize diversity in health research. Increasing diversity in research enrollment necessitates a concerted effort to strengthen regulatory and operational system. It calls for a commitment to expanding healthcare expenditure in Africa and enhancing data representation for drug approvals on the continent. While the FDA and the US government are taking strides in emphasizing diversity within their community, it's essential to question what African governments and research communities are doing to address this critical issue. If we are to submit a trial today at SAHPRA with 5 sites, where are those sites located as an example, and what kind of data demographics are they collecting? It is a call to action for researchers, institutions, government policymakers, and community. Let us work together to ensure that healthcare research benefits everyone and we're leaving no one behind. So that is me at the end, Madre. This is what I wanted to share with the people that honored us today. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, Vicky. I just, you know, from our point of view, I want to know, should Africa consider adopting the requirements observed in Asian markets? And what consequences might such a move entail?
I think it's such a good question, Madre, because I mean, what does it mean if for example, let's give an example today, Merck, as an example, wants to submit Keytruda for a new indication in South Africa, and they present their dossier to SAHPRA. And then in that dossier, SAHPRA recognized that the demographic representation of that data, it doesn't basically covers the demographic of South African people. Should SAHPRA then say no to registration of that drug? You know, I think it's I'm not saying SAHPRA should say no. I don't have the answer. I just think it's a conversation that we need to have. And I think with the implementation of AMA, it may be more meaningful if it's the whole of Africa standing together and say, these are the requirements for Africa. Because I mean, if we are a continent that hosts more than 1 billion people, we should be able to have a voice. But if it's just, in my view, of South Africa with just 54 million people, we may have lesser of a voice. So if we come together with the solutions that are forthcoming, we may be able to have the impactful decision making, if I may put it that way, unless other people in the group wants to contribute into that question, and what will be their take in that kind of scenario.
So I have a question here from an attendee who's thanking you for your presentation. He wants to know if there's some African requirements and standards to conduct clinical trials at AMA level. I don't think so yet, but you can answer. If no, how can we realize the clinical trials in African countries? So it sort of comes to the point of, in South Africa, it's going to be 4 million, and then if it's Africa, it's 1 billion. So how can we do it? What is the next step? And is AMA taking those steps to start working towards it?
I don't know much what is happening at AMA, but I can just speak on what I wish could happen, or if I was to be given a chance to speak to AMA. What I would basically say when it comes to clinical trials, I think if we have that united regulator in Africa, we can be able to come up with standards that can be applicable for clinical trials that are conducted across Africa. At the end of the day, clinical trials follow the same global standard, which is ICH GCP standard all across Africa. So it's already standardized. It's just that the actual collection of data, it's not happening in all region of Africa to be able to contribute impactful, meaningful data to inform registration of medicine that is representative of the African population. So if there's an opportunity for us, even from SACRA or even other bigger clinical research association organizations to inform AMA on diversity, I'm sure there's a lot of people that can raise a hand to actually lead that.
Thank you, Vicky. I just want to tell these people putting up their hands, can you please pop your questions in either the webinar chat or the Q&A session, and I'll continue asking the questions from there. I do see, hi Sarah Cohen is here. Vicky, she says it's a great talk. How do we address the racial demographics for recruitment in South Africa, as this appears to be exclusive? So I'm assuming, Sarah, we're talking, for the whole of it's not just for clinical trials. Is it, recruitment? How do you recruit the people? What is happening?
I think I understand. If we're to think of South Africa, so let me put a spanner into it. So let's think about it this way: is data that has been collected from South Africa representative of African demographics? So not South African demographics, because we're speaking at a broader scale. So where are South African sites located? So let's say South Africa currently has been in the fortunate side of receiving more trials and being active in more trials. The data that South Africa has been contributing to some of the drugs that are being registered, what is the demographic landscape of that data? Meaning, where are the patients being recruited? And I don't want us to focus on infectious disease much. I just want us to take an example of an oncology trial. Where are the oncology trials being conducted? Most of the trial centers in South Africa are located in urban areas. We know that. And who are the people that are being recruited to participate, especially in those pivotal trials? So I'm not quite sure about that. I don't think we have records that shows in South Africa at a country level the demographics of participants, but we can make some assumptions based on where the sites are located. So if the sites were located in rural KwaZulu-Natal, as an example, you will expect that we'll have higher African population participating in clinical trials. So I think there's still work to be done in South Africa itself to increase the racial demographics of the patients that participate in clinical trials. I hope I do answer Sarah.
Sarah, just let us know if that's good. Yes, he says, thank you so much. I have Nathaniel. Nathaniel is actually touching on something that we wanted to discuss. He's mentioning, let's start by building capacity. Investigators, sites, and researchers, and I'm sure Omar can drive this as well when they're established, probably. But and one of the questions we have that also talks to capacity is, does Africa have operational capacity to generate data for clinical trials to support registration? So talking about capacity.
Yeah, I think Africa does have operational capacity to generate data. If we were to say, what is that operational capacity? What is it that we need in Africa to run clinical trials or to conduct clinical trials? So first of all is the workforce. Trials have been conducted for more than 20 years in Africa, which means we have built the workforce. Is the expertise, the research expertise. Trials have been conducted for more than 50 years, in 20 years in Africa, which means we do have the expertise when it comes to the experience of running clinical trials. When we look at the patients as an example, I've touched on that, we do have the patients in Africa to participate in clinical trials. Do we have the CRO to run the trials? We have lots of CROs to run the trials in Africa. And then do we have the infrastructure, research sites in Africa? I was fortunate recently to be in Kenya, and I was able to go to the biggest research sites that I've never even seen in South Africa, as an example. There's the largest research sites that I've seen, and the work that they do in Kenya, it's big. It's just that probably they maybe focus on other elements of research. I was also fortunate to go to Uganda recently, and I was able to see bigger research centers that I've never seen in South Africa, as an example. So I think there's a lot in Africa happening. We just don't know about it, or we are not able to sell ourselves, to the world, to actually show them that we are able and we have the operational capacity to run those trials.
I want to add to that, actually. I think as soon as we start, we don't probably have to, in the end of it, when we do ARMA and everything's happening, we don't need to have to prove to anybody to come do clinical trials. We'll do it on our own anyway. So, so I think it's the process where everybody's working towards. Pat Manda has said that regulatory unification essentially is mandatory for a success. Yes, absolutely. But Manda, I think we all agree. Everybody is working towards that. Regulatory unification to ensure that we can get the numbers, we can get the manufacturing happening in Africa, and that will then hopefully move towards more clinical trials happening towards that. Bridget Tasindi is saying, absolutely great, thought-provoking presentation, Vicky, well done. You have challenged us to think more on how we can contribute. So this is always talking about Ubuntu. That's exactly the direction we want to. We want everybody to work together to work this. Yvonne Uni from Kenya, pharma drug data must represent the ethnic, geographic, and socioeconomic status and racial tribe and subgroups of Africa. That's a mouthful. That's a lot of different tribes and ethnic groups. I mean, just merely in one region in South Africa, it's quite tough. Vicky, what's your thoughts?
Yes, like I did say initially when I started, that there is many areas of diversity to focus on. And obviously the first bigger one is race. And maybe it's not even bigger than the socio-economic status, because the biggest challenge is participating in drug studies which produce efficacious drugs that you are not able to afford as a community. I think that is another challenge. And for the data generation, I think we can solve that much easier. But when it comes to the economics of how Africa operates, it's also a different discussion. And it does contribute to diversity, because it will not help for us now to go and perform clinical trials for this blockbuster molecule, and the community in Africa is unable to benefit from it. So it's really a big challenge. But let's solve one at a time.
One at a time. There we go.
Yeah.
Terhani is asking, so she's got a big thing here. I'm going to read it out for you. Great talk, Becky. I would like to comment on the first question raised by Madre regarding to African regulatory authorities mimicking the China and Indian requirements with regard to diversity inclusion. Africa being the most populous continent after Asia, that idea is not far-fetched. In my experience, spanning from the pharma and sponsorship CRO to regulatory, sponsors often have no issues following such requirements. However, how the changes requirements get communicated to the sponsors is often a challenge. At local level, what are we doing as Africans to ensure our local regulatory requirements are honored and facilitating a conducive environment to attract more trials? So I think actually, sorry, Becky, before you answer that, actually, this is actually one of the topics we're going to be discussing in the Afri Summit. So it's a nice little starting point for you, Becky.
Yeah, and I must just tell the people here that please join us in Egypt for the Afri Summit. It will be quite interesting, and there will be great learnings. And I think it's great that it's basically focused on regulators. You know, the Afri Summit. The first 2 days, it's going to be looking at the different regulators that will be looking at how they improve their operations and all that kind of stuff. So basically, how do we increase operational effectiveness of regulators in order for us to attract clinical trials in Africa? I think let's take we look at what can lead to that operational effectiveness in African regulations compared to others, and primarily focusing on clinical trials. Obviously, are the requirements clear? Are they available? Are they honored? Are the timelines clear? Are they available, and are they honored? And obviously, are the regulators capacitated to evaluate different protocols that are submitted to them? Coming from South Africa and having worked in other regions in Africa, I do think multiple countries in Africa, they have clear regulatory requirements. You can even go to CleanRegs. I like what CleanRegs is doing because they are basically going into different African regulators' portals, and they compile information in a way that is standardized. You know, so if you are looking for information for Kenya and Uganda and South Africa, you are able to see it in a standardized fashion. I think the biggest challenge is where is the information when it comes to requirements, but the information is available. I had opportunities at some point to even consult with different regulators like ZAMRI, as an example from Zambia, when we were submitting a certain protocol at some point. That shows that the regulator is open to having conversation with pharma. You know, they are open to grow the clinical trials market, not necessarily just to attract clinical trials, but to ensure that the trials that are conducted in Africa, they benefit Africa as a region. So I think with the requirements, the timelines, are we comparable? Are we competitive when it comes to timelines for approval of clinical trials? If you were to look at timelines, I haven't looked at timelines recently, but I have looked at timelines of different regulators in different countries at some point. If we were to compare the timelines for South Africa, for Kenya, for Uganda, from the time when a protocol is submitted to the time when the protocol is approved, how are we looking if we compare to other regions? Those are some of the stuff that we must look at. I was amazed when I saw in Australia it can take 5 days to approve a trial. You know, so they have the ethics body, but the regulator in Australia can actually approve a trial in 5 days. You know, so how do we grow to those levels? But I mean, there's other reasons why maybe we cannot grow to those levels. Other regulators, the RANIs, for example, they have with FDA, they have those meetings before the actual protocol goes through review. As an example, I forgot the name of the meetings. We don't have that in South Africa. I think at one point I recall Prof. Ralph commenting that the time when we receive as a protocol at a CTC meeting, it's actually the first time they get to know about that drug, as an example. Unlike with the pre-submission meetings, yes. Unlike with the FDA, where there's consultations when the protocol is being written. So the timelines will be different because the regulators or the people that are reviewing the material, they need to spend more time to understand. And you understand, it's science. You can't just you can't cheat science. You have to go through all the data to actually understand what is happening. I hope I answer your question well, but I mean, we are able to attract trials, and we don't want to attract trials. We want to do them here, and we also want to be able to grow to become sponsors of trials that can be conducted outside of Africa.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Beaky. I want to reiterate what Ioni said. Thank you, everybody, for joining. She really, truly enjoyed the discussion, and so did I. It was a gem of a presentation from Beaky. I'm not important, I'm just a facilitator, and it's important that everybody got their information. We have one query yet, the Q&A. The person is asking to have the site with the consolidated registration requirements. I'm not sure if there's a site to have all the regular, what do they call it? Consolidated registration requirement. I don't think there's a site with all of that together. But we are going to connect with all the regulators in October, and then there will be clear information about that. All right, thank you so much, Beaky. It was just an honor to work with you continually every year, and we're so happy to have you at AfriSummit this year. Do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone that made time to attend, and I do note that it's not like the expect, but if we can continue this conversation in different platforms and continue raising visibility on our capabilities in Africa, we will be able to reach even a greater heights. But thank you very much for making time to attend, and I hope you enjoyed your lunch.
Thank you, everybody.